Political economist Patrick Bond is a professor at the University of Johannesburg's Department of Sociology. He joins us now to talk about this. Patrick, issues under discussion at the forum will include the continent's aspirations to reach the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals alongside the African Union's Agenda 2063 goals. So the G20 has a new 1.1 billion rands fund, $1 billion fund for pandemic prevention and preparedness. But I'm wondering what is possible and what can be learned from the recent successes of the World Trade Organization. And I'm saying the point of what Africa can negotiate for.
Well, that's a great question, Sapisa. It's great to be with you. And I think because there is a mixed, let's say, impression of how well South Africa has done in the WTO in June, where not only President Ramaphosa, but he was joined by Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, and many other leaders, but they didn't really get what they wanted. And that's because of Western selfishness, to be frank. And it's not really just the United States, as typically the case, but Britain, Germany, Switzerland, and Norway. They opposed a full waiver of the intellectual property rights on COVID-19 vaccines and treatment. And of course, that's where the big profits are for the big pharma corps that help elect these governments to power. And I think that's the dilemma. It's the dilemma we're seeing this week in Egypt, where big oil and gas companies and, the sort of fossil reliance sectors, the U.S. Army, they're simply not conceding. President Biden and his climate envoy, John Kerry, simply not conceding on loss and damage and paying a climate debt that the West owes. Likewise, debates about whether China should join that. So these are, I think, the critical moments is a geopolitical conflict with Russia versus Ukraine, and two sides on this one that split Africa right down the middle, and whether the African Union should come in. These represent the topics of the next couple of days, and the stakes are very high and expectations, unfortunately, are low.
And speaking of the African Union, there's been a push to secure a permanent membership of the G20 for the African Union, particularly because while South Africa can push for the African agenda, but it cannot speak for every African country because, our nation's interests and challenges are not necessarily monolithic. How much is this an important factor in ensuring that African interests are really seen and heard, taken into account when negotiating some of these issues?
You're right. And the hope is that it's not just a tokenistic gesture by President Ramaphosa yesterday saying he would raise the option of not just observer status, but member status for the African Union. And Macky Sall, the Senegalese president who's head of the AU, plus the head of the AU Development Agency, the Rwandan president, Paul Kagame, they're in Indonesia with President Ramaphosa. Maybe this is a good opportunity for an African United Front. The EU, after all, is a member, and it really would be logical so that it's not simply a South African sole representative, as you say, sometimes very different interests between South Africa and the rest of the world. In the WTO, in the UNFCCC, the climate summit, South Africa often takes a different position than do the poorest countries. So these are really great moments to say, well, could we see South Africa not acting as a sort of ally of the West, as sometimes it's accused of a sub-imperial force, but actually a force that would welcome the African Union? I fear it may be tokenistic, although you're seeing the Indonesian leaders there. Joko Widodo, the president of Indonesia, says he supports it. And then next year, we'll see the G20 move to India. And I suspect Narendra Modi would probably support the African Union joining. But I don't think the West wants to see the G20 whittled down or watered down, let's say, by having voices of very poor countries. They really like the idea that this is the meeting place, as it was most critically, as you said, in 2009, when $750 million were suddenly conjured up for the big global financial crisis by not just the West, but by this new layer of emerging countries, the G20.
So taking all of these dynamics into account, The G20 itself seen as an effective instrument for advancing much needed global governance reforms and orienting the international development agenda, some of which we've just spoken about. But if this is the case, why is it that it has still not met the promises that it's made since the last time, the G20 leaders got together?
Yes, it's really a cul-de-sac, isn't it? The whole multilateral system. If we're hoping this week, the second week of the climate summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, for any real progress, we'll be disappointed. If we were hoping for the West to surrender intellectual property on COVID-19 vaccines and treatment for global public good, we were disappointed. If we were hoping for reforms in the IMF and the World Bank so that they wouldn't be quite so strict, we've been victims in the last two loans from the IMF and the World Bank of austerity. Well, again, disappointment. There's always talk of this global governance reform, but it's not evident. And because the, let's say, economic interests of the West were in 2008 and 9, when the G20 really came together, to expand the bailout net. It was really to get over the world financial crisis. We have that again with the COVID crisis, a world financial meltdown, and the Western powers agreed to act in unity to expand the monetary supply, quantitative easing, so that there'd be enough liquidity in the world economy. But, with those two exceptions of sort of bailing themselves out, I simply don't see either the West or the newer blocs, the BRICS bloc, which President Ramaphosa hosts next year, really getting serious about the global crises. And so we're continuing to spiral down with a climate crisis, with potential new pandemics, and also with inequality at a world record high, and with geopolitical tensions at the level where people fear a nuclear conflagration.
Obviously, just given the global financial constraints, reducing debt, contending with high inflation, that will be top of line. But the question is, we know there'll be bilateral talks between the US and China. The outcome of that, how is it expected to impact on Africa? And of course, what they advocate for the rest of the developing nations. Risk stemming from supply disruption, rising inflation, as we mentioned, weak investments. These are just some of the top three risks that need to be addressed urgently in relation to scarring from the pandemic, but also what we've seen in terms of the war in Europe, global cooperation, including the gradual reopening of borders.
Yeah, it's terribly disappointing that that whole agenda is just not being addressed properly. The way that our foreign minister, Naledi Pandor, put it, she can't even get the special drawing rights, the sort of chunk of liquid money in the International Monetary Fund, to be properly shared out. There's rhetoric to that effect. They talk left, but they walk right. And the walk right at the moment is much higher world interest rates, which will cause, according to some of the most recent IMF research, probably around 50 countries to near bankruptcy unless there's some sort of bailout. We're luckily not among those, but our foreign debt at $170 billion, especially with all the new loans that have been contracted in the last few days, make us also quite nervous about global interest rates. They're going through the roof. And we've had problems before in, for example, 1985 defaulting. And we really haven't seen that kind of, let's say, global monetary and financial reform that would be generous, that would treat the world in a spirit that we're all human beings. And where there's climate debt that the North owes, and there's financial debt that the South owes, and most of those South countries are victims of terrible incidents like we had in KwaZulu-Natal, 500 people dead on April 11 this year, and no money for genuine recovery. The Durban sewage system still broken as a result. And as a result of, I think, these incredible contradictions between, say, a climate debt the North should pay, and I would add China and Russia and probably South Africa to the debtors, but also the debt that the African, especially the lower income countries, there must be some resolution if we had some visionary leadership. As Naledi Pandor says, you can't even get a small piece of that, the IMF special drawing rights, because the leaders are selfish and they do feel, as you say, that they have to now impose austerity and raise interest rates. It's a tragic situation where the world really needs much more imaginative and visionary and generous leadership.
Thank you so much for your time, political analyst and economist Patrick Bond, professor at the University of Johannesburg's Department of Sociology.